esta charla que nos brindará desde Seattle, Estados Unidos. Y esto porque los desafíos y riesgos del sistema globalizado de producción y distribución de alimentos y los desajustes en la dieta de los distintos habitantes del planeta que oscilan entre la obesidad y la malnutrición son materias abordadas en el reconocido libro El hambre que viene, cuyo afamado autor, Paul Roberts, ya lo tenemos en línea, en vivo y en directo, vía Zoom. En los próximos segundos establecerá una cercana conversación precisamente con quien moderará este espacio. Hablamos del presidente del Consejo Regional de la Araucanía a nivel nacional, quien nos representa en la Araucanía a nivel nacional, el presidente nacional de los consejeros, y quien será el encargado de conversar vía electrónica con Paul Roberts. Así que invitamos a Marcelo para que suba a nuestro espacio porque ya estamos afinando la conexión. Un momento muy, pero muy importante porque se trata ni más ni menos que de la clase magistral de esta cuarta cumbre mundial de las regiones sobre seguridad y soberanía alimentaria. Marcelo, la audiencia es suya.
Sí.
Hello. Thank you for the kind introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? Fantastic. Well, I want to, it's very good to be here electronically. I wish I could be there in person. I know these are challenging times for travelers, and I appreciate that the organizers went to the effort to bring me in electronically. It's very good to be talking with you. I want to explain a little bit about my whereabouts. Typically, when you do a webinar, you're back.
Paul,
yes, sir.
Si nos permiten un momento, primero destacar la participación de Paul Roberts en esta cuarta cumbre de seguridad alimentaria. Para los asistentes, miembros del Buró de Oro Fogar, encabezado por su presidente, los consejeros y consejeras regionales de Chile, de la región también de la Araucanía, y también algunas personas que dicen relación, que van a participar, que dicen relación también con lo que ha escrito Paul Roberts. Él vive en el estado de Washington. Él ha escrito dos libros importantes. Uno que habla del fin del petróleo y el segundo que nos conlleva a esta cumbre, que habla de el hambre que viene, que tiene que ver con lo que hemos estado trabajando estos 2 días, que tiene que ver con la seguridad alimentaria, que tiene que ver con la visión que él tuvo a partir del año 2008, cuando él publica su libro, que se adelantó a los tiempos. Y cuando una persona es visionaria, tiene la capacidad de adelantarse a los tiempos. Y él nos adelanta y lo llevamos acá a la región de la Araucanía. Esta región era una región agrícola que se transformó en forestal y que hoy día, producto de la matriz productiva, esta región se está transformando en frutícola y también vinícola. Y vamos por O'Higgins para hacer la región con mejores mostos del país. Esperamos que su presentación nos sitúe en la visión que él tuvo, pero también nos permita a nosotros, al mundo público, a articularse y a enfrentar una realidad que en Chile no la habíamos tomado el peso y que hoy esta región, la región más pobre de Chile, pero que tiene una capacidad en su gente y una fuerza, el Nehuen que se tiene, nos va a permitir ser la punta de lanza para enfrentar la seguridad alimentaria y la nutrición. Gracias, Paul Robert, por permitirnos poder escuchar, conocer de tu conocimiento, tu experiencia y tu expertise. Bienvenido al cuarto foro de seguridad alimentaria y nutricional. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to attend. Thank you also for the accommodation to allow me to remain here in Seattle. And unfortunately, I wish I could join you, but in person, but I'm hoping that joining you electronically will suffice. So today I want to talk about resilience. Resilience of our food system, our global food system. And by resilience, what do I mean? I mean the capacity to survive shocks to the system, whether those are supply chain shocks, whether they're price shocks from energy costs, whether they're political shocks, or the shock of war, or the shock of a changing climate. Building a global food system that is resilient and can survive these shocks and still produce the food we need is absolutely critical. Now, we can see that today, of course. We're in the midst of yet another food crisis. We have rising prices of food. Many of the inputs that are critical for food production, whether that be oil or fertilizer, or even spare parts for our machinery, the prices for those have risen dramatically. And so we're in a moment where we're asking, does our system have enough resilience to survive this crisis? But what's interesting is this is not the first time, as you all know, that our food system has been tested. Let's go back to 2007, 2008. As many of you will recall, things were quite similar to what they are today. Like today, we saw soaring prices for grain and other food. We saw rising prices for inputs like energy and fertilizer. We saw widespread concern and fear about food insecurity around the world, whether we were talking about Asia, Africa, even parts of the United States and Europe. What was different back then was a sense of optimism. Even in the midst of this crisis, back in 2007, 2008, there was discussion about ways to improve the system. You may recall these. We talked about the importance of local and regional production. We talked about our health concerns around industrial farming, some of our concerns around the pathogens and other health risks and how we could improve those. We talked about ways to use new technologies to reduce the inputs of energy and fertilizer and to improve crop yields. And so even in the midst of that crisis in 2007, 2008, there was considerable optimism that we might use that crisis to motivate us, to improve the system, to improve resilience. But what happened? Very little, because a little over 10 years later, we find ourselves in a very similar situation, facing many of the same problems. And our systems have many of the same vulnerabilities. We haven't really improved our resilience, even though we get these periodic reminders that resilience is more and more important. So why is that? That's what I wanted to have a discussion about today. Why is it that we struggle to improve resilience? Why is it so hard? And what can we do about it? What steps can we take? So what do we mean by resilience? What do we need to have a resilient food system? Many people have different ideas about this. I focus on three areas. The first, to have a resilient food system, whether you're talking about a global system, a regional system, or a local system, the first thing you need is spare capacity. You need extra production capacity, shipping capacity, storage capacity in the system in order to buffer consumers and producers in the event of supply shocks. On top of that, you also need the capacity for innovation. You need a budget for research, for technology, and for change. And that has to be conscious and explicit. The last thing you need is political capacity for response and focus. By that, I mean, you need to have political awareness within governments at all levels, that the food system and resilience is a top priority. Because without that focus, it's too easy to allow these kinds of crises to sneak up on us. So you need these three things: spare capacity, the capacity for innovation, and the capacity for political response and action. I would argue that as a world community, as a food industry, and as a community of people who are deeply concerned with the food system, we don't have those three things, or nearly to the degree that we need them. Now let's think back to in the past, because we've actually done much better historically around resilience. There have been times in the last half century when various countries and groups of countries have come together to create a more resilient food system. So let's look at those examples and see what worked and what didn't and why. And then ask ourselves, are there lessons from the past that we can bring forward? Let's consider the post-war period, the period right after World War II. Consider that after the fighting had stopped, there were deep food crises across the globe, in Africa, Europe, and Asia, parts of Central and South America. And there was an effort led initially primarily by the United States to improve food security, a massive and very expensive effort. Initially, that effort took the form of food aid, direct food aid, either in form of grain or in payments. But it began to expand and began to use elements of science, technology, and foreign aid policy. We have the Green Revolution, as you all recall. For better and for worse, that through that Green Revolution, technologies that were developed primarily in the developed world were transferred to nations that sorely needed improved food technologies. And the result in some respects, was a massive increase in food output. With that came a lot of research and development, a lot of funding, both from governments like the United States and Europe and other governments, but also from big foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Now we know in retrospect that the Green Revolution came at a great cost, both politically and in terms of health and in terms of cultural and social impacts. But at the time, it represented a massive and sustained and conscious effort by governments to improve the resilience of the global food system and to recognize that the status quo was not sufficient to deal with shocks. Now, in this case, it was the shock both of war and the shock of rapid population growth. But the idea that we can improve our food systems and strengthen them against shocks was an important idea. And you could see that idea expanding. The United States and Europe, for example, governments began to create massive stockpiles of grain. Now, these allowed them to support farmers when the farmers produced too much, but it also created these stockpiles that could be used in times of short supply. We spent billions of dollars in foreign aid to help countries in Africa and Asia buy our grain. And in that, you can begin to see that our resilience wasn't necessarily driven by our hearts. It was driven by political and economic motives. This is the Cold War, the fight between the United States and the Soviet Union. And both those countries used food aid and like programs as part of their foreign policy objectives. So we supported countries in Africa and Asia and sent them green revolution technologies and helped them improve their resilience, in part because we wanted them to be on our side of the Cold War. So we had an ulterior motive. And the problem is that when the Cold War was over and the Berlin Wall came down, that motive disappeared. And with it, a lot of the drive and energy behind our official government efforts to improve global resilience in the global food system. We didn't forget the idea, but we began to think that resilience in the food system could be guaranteed through other means. No longer would we need to use government funding, government programs, government research. Instead, the private free market would be unleashed and would be allowed to improve resilience in the food system. One of the big focuses was our trade-based system. Instead of encouraging individual countries to improve their own food production systems, to make them more resilient, more productive, we instead encouraged them simply to purchase grain from the big exporters, whether that be the United States or in Europe or elsewhere. We argued that that was much more efficient, a much more efficient way to improve the resilience of the entire global food system than it was to encourage production in each separate country. And this was part of a larger philosophy that dominated foreign policy and economic debates in many countries during this period, the 1980s and 1990s. And there was much to support it, as you recall. Trade is an efficient system in most circumstances. And it is the case that some producers, some exporters, like the United States, for example, have advantages in certain kinds of food production, in corn and soybeans, for example, in the case of the United States, or pork production. And so it seemed to make sense to use our great efficiencies in the United States, for example, and efficiently produce those grains those proteins here, and then simply export them to countries who might not have had the same resilient food systems. And by and large, generally speaking, the system worked until it didn't. I mean, as we've seen currently, just as we saw in 2007, 2008, that global system works until it encounters a shock. And one of the problems is that where the old government systems had a lot of spare capacity, you might call that inefficiency, a lot of stockpiles, a lot of spare shipping capacity, a lot of spare research capacity. These private trade systems were much leaner. It was just-in-time delivery. It's not surprising because none of the companies, none of the individual players wanted to pay for that spare capacity. Why should they keep that on their books? Why should they plant more than they actually needed to harvest? Why should they build a bigger warehouse? Why should they add trucks to their fleet they didn't actually need, or ships to their fleet? At that level, it makes sense. You want to have your system as lean and as cost efficient as possible. But when we step back and look at the entire system, that lean, just-in-time philosophy leaves no room for error. There's no resilience. There's no capacity to withstand a shock. So as we've seen over the past few years, just as we saw in 2007, 2008, as soon as there was a breakdown in the system, as soon as a producer was unable to, as soon as a crop failed, for example, or production was slowed because of a strike, or in the more recent case, as soon as war shut down export terminals in Ukraine, or energy costs made it almost too expensive to ship grain, or a labor shortage made it almost impossible to find truck drivers, or all of these things happened at once. As soon as that interrupted this efficient, just-in-time system, the system itself nearly collapsed. Now we're moving through our second supply chain shock. And instead of having made any substantial improvements since the last time, really the only thing that's changed is that there are more risks for more shocks. So now we have China, for example, as a major user of many of the inputs that we need, that everyone needs to produce food. Oil now has returned as a politicized commodity. War, which of course we had never truly put war behind us, but the idea of a large-scale European war, who would have predicted that even a few years ago? And yet here we are, and we're seeing precisely the kind of shocks that you would imagine for such a large-scale war, particularly when that war strikes in one of the most important grain-producing regions in the world. And then, of course, you bring in things like population growth, changes in demographics that affect the labor market, and of course, the risks of climate change, which we were already seeing 10 years ago, but now have only multiplied in everything from drought to the expansion of infection and pests. When you add in those things, you realize that our system continues to need more resilience and more efforts. So we find ourselves, once again, in a position of needing to make change. And yet, we're cynical, or perhaps I'm cynical, because we've been here before. I'm just now old enough to have lived through a couple of these crises and to remember the promises that we made ourselves and the optimism that we had, that this time it would change, that we would use the crisis as a kind of a motivator, much the same way that some countries, some governments, some foundations use the crisis of the post-war period as a motivator to build a more resilient food system. So we find ourselves in roughly the same place, but perhaps with some benefits that we didn't have 10 years ago. We have better technology today, not just better seeds, better breeding programs, but massive computer power that can allow us to solve very complicated problems related to food production, whether we're talking about building a more resilient supply chain and building in capacity to that supply chain, spare capacity that can buffer us against shocks, whether we're talking about breeding programs, whether we're talking about technologies that can help us reduce the amount of meat that we consume. I realize that's a very sensitive topic. I myself have enjoyed meat all my life, and I am somewhat fearful of a future where I might not be able to enjoy meat. And yet I realize that the impact on the various systems that meat production and consumption brings requires us to take another look. And I believe technology can help. What else has changed that's encouraging to me? People of my age, my generation, we try to adapt, we try to evolve, but speaking for myself, I know that I can become cynical and pessimistic. I've been disappointed too many times. But my children and other people in their generation, in some respects, they're much more optimistic. And their optimism and their willingness to continue pushing and demanding for change, I find that very encouraging. They don't have all the answers. And sometimes some of the answers they do have are pretty ridiculous, I must say. But the fact that they are out there pushing, it encourages me. And it makes me realize that the generations can work together. But really, at the end of the day, what's required here is hard thinking, hard decisions, and actual material improvements. And I'm going to leave you with a few suggestions that I have. And then I'd really like to open up the conversation and hear your thoughts, your responses to some of the ideas that I've raised, but also some of your thoughts for improving resilience. And even whether you agree with me that resilience is as critical a feature of our future food system as I think it is. So a couple of those ideas. There's no way that we're ever going to replace the global system of trade, nor should we. It's absolutely important that we allow efficient producers, exporters to do what they do best and to help feed countries and communities that need some help. At the same time, though, we cannot rely on trade alone. We've seen what happens. We understand how vulnerable that system can be, particularly when we insist that it be lean and mean and have no spare capacity. So we'll need to modify our trading system. And that's not an easy task, because what we're essentially asking, we are asking the companies that run that trading system to carry the extra costs of that spare production capacity. And how do we ask them to do that? What is the justification? Well, at the end of the day, it's probably going to mean taxpayers paying those private companies to maintain that extra production capacity. We either pay it through taxes or we pay it through higher food prices or some other credit system, but somehow that spare production capacity has to be paid for. And that's a tough request to make at a time of high food inflation. Politically, I don't think you can make that request. But in a year or two after inflation, assuming inflation does recede to some degree, this is an idea that is going to need to be discussed. It's a conversation we're going to have, because the idea that we can continue to have this global trading system, this supply chain that has no spare production capacity, it's suicide. It's worldwide suicide. We've had more confirmation over the past couple of years of that very problem, and we have to change. Exactly how that system, how that spare production capacity is rebuilt into our trading system, it's a challenge. And it's going to require the best minds and a lot of political will, but it must happen. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion is to rethink and revitalize the ideas of local and regional food production. I know I've just talked about the importance of the efficiency of exporting nations like the United States, but we have to put some of that spare production capacity I was just talking about, not just in the form of additional ships or warehouses, but in the form of additional output and production and farming in countries that have traditionally been big importers. This is not a new idea. It's quite fashionable, in fact. I mean, you will recall in the United States, in Europe, and I'm sure elsewhere, local farms, small farms, local food became very fashionable and quite profitable. And farmers markets became a huge trend. And that was all good because I think it encouraged consumers to realize that there were other ways to get their food and that they didn't need to simply rely on distant producers. The problem was that it also encouraged consumers to think about local producers as sort of a high-end consumable. So you would pay $10 for an heirloom tomato. And perhaps some upper income person could afford that. But even in America, many people couldn't. And so it wasn't actually a solution. So when I talk about local food production and revitalizing that, it needs to be as efficient as some of these global supply chains are. And that's a big ask too. That's going to require technology and new policies. And it's probably going to require some help from taxpayers. I think my last point is we're going to once again have to treat food and food security and resilience as a separate, special priority. In the post-war period, and in the several decades after the post-war, I recall growing up during the 60s and 70s and seeing commercials on TV and in the newspapers warning me about the risks of famine. It was everywhere, the idea that food insecurity was this critical crisis. But that began to fade, and we began to see food security as part of other kinds of security. If we had economic growth, if we had technologies, innovation, if we had political liberalization, those would contribute to the improvement in many systems, including food security. And we would no longer have to focus separately on the idea of food security and resilience. And that was all to the good, except that I think it allowed us to stop being aware of the separate and distinct and unique importance of our food systems and the need to make them resilient. And so I think we need to bring the food system, surface it, and make it its own idea once again. Now, I'm speaking to people who need no encouragement there. I mean, you have all been focused on food security and related issues probably for most of your careers, but in the mainstream, in many countries, up until, say, the last few years with inflation, I think food has become a secondary issue, at least in terms of policy, and we've got to make it a primary issue again. So with that, I'll stop talking, and I'd be interested in your responses and feedback and your ideas. And thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a ti, Paul. Un abrazo a la distancia. Aquí toda la audiencia está muy atento tomando nota cada uno de los puntos que usted nos ha entregado desde Seattle, Estados Unidos, directamente hasta nuestra Araucanía. Vamos a recorrer la audiencia con micrófonos para que le hagan preguntas directamente a Paul, que está muy atento. Van a decir su nombre, de dónde vienen y cuál es la pregunta. ¿Hay preguntas? Vamos a ver si hay preguntas de la audiencia. Por ahí tenemos la primera.
Hola, buenas tardes. Soy Ornella Tiboni, trabajo en FAO. No sé si la pregunta la debo hacer en español o en inglés. No sé si hay traducción para... Voy a asumir que sí hay traducción. ¿Sí?
Perfectamente.
Yeah.
If you can English, that would be fantastic. I appreciate
Okay,
it.
then I'll go in English. So thank you very much for your speech. It's been very interesting hearing you. I consider myself a young person, so when you were speaking about the hope that youth have, that touched me a lot. And one question I do have is, how do you think we can listen more to youth, to young people? Because for instance, in this one instance, youth are not very represented, as we usually call for authorities and so, and they are older, right? So how, in your opinion, youth could be more involved in the decision-taking processes? That's one question, and then I would take advantage of the mic and do another one. So the second one would be, also in your opinion and experience, what do you think about the true cost accounting? Because if we take into consideration the externalities that fast food and, in the environment and health and even the social context of producers, manufacturers. So if we take into consideration true cost accounting, then fast food would be much more expensive than fresh and healthy food, right? So I think that's, in my personal perspective, that would be an interesting approach into transforming the food system into a more sustainable and healthier one. So yeah, what do you think about it, and how could we move forward into that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Those are both really good. So in terms of bringing young people more into the conversation, that's very challenging. I mean, for the reasons you raise, we tend to dismiss. I mean, my generation tends to dismiss the young generation. Structurally, they're often excluded from the conversations. I think one area where they are well represented is the education system. And I've seen successful programs that begin a conversation with young people in elementary school, in the primary schools, where sometimes they learn to garden, they learn about food production, they visit farms, and they begin thinking of food as a system. It can be highly politicized in parts of the United States, for example. Some communities really object to teachers teaching students about sustainable agriculture because it carries so much political meaning. But it is a way to have the conversation both with young people and with the community. In terms of true cost accounting, I mean, this is absolutely true and essential. I think that the risk is political, and that is we can take a food product and we can list all the externalities, all the costs, the social costs, the health costs, the environmental costs, the political costs. But the more costs that we list, the less likely politically we are to be able to redeploy those costs. By that I mean, if we present an industrialized food product as nothing but externalities, politically that's very tough to sell to a mainstream voter. And I think that what is sometimes very discouraging for food advocates is that we may have to choose one or two external costs, maybe a social cost, maybe the cost of bad health, maybe a climate cost. And we have to limit we have to limit our discussion to one or two costs so that we can pass legislation and not frighten off so many voters. Now, I realize this can be seen as cowardly and timid, but I've also seen people and countries and companies fight so hard against things like a carbon trading system for climate. And this is a system that would be so efficient in helping us deal with climate change. And yet there's so much political pushback. And I think that we need to sometimes take this incrementally. Some people will tell you that the perfect is the enemy of the good. I know that's also a recipe for disaster, but I think what we need to do is find a sweet spot, a middle ground where we identify these external costs, and yet we choose the ones, we prioritize the ones that we want to cost into the system.
Vamos a generar dos preguntas más de la audiencia para Paul, que amablemente está conectado con la lógica participación de nuestra comunidad. Por allá tenemos otra interrogante. ¿Tu nombre, de dónde vienes?
Je m'appelle Khalifa Ababakar Ndaw, je parle français, je pense qu'il va me comprendre. Je suis le président du conseil départemental de Dagana, donc un département qui est dans la Saint-Louis et du Sénégal. Voilà, en fait, moi, d'abord, je vous félicite de l'exposé que vous venez de nous livrer, qui est très plein d'enseignements. Vous avez donc parlé de la sécurité alimentaire et résiliente aux chocs, aux différents chocs. Mais moi, je voulais quand même vous poser la question de savoir, est-ce que ce système alimentaire dont vous parlez ne doit pas être articulé à une alimentation saine et équilibrée pour ne pas tomber dans la malnutrition si éventuellement cette alimentation est élaborée à partir des pesticides, des ONG et aussi de l'engrais. Est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas articuler cette sécurité alimentaire à une production d'aliments sains et équilibrés? Voilà, je vous remercie.
I think this is an excellent point. I mean, we all recall the big bird flu outbreaks of 10 and 12 years ago. These were warning signs, these were red flags pointing to the risks of these industrialized protein production facilities. One question is whether as a society we're willing to accept that level of risk. That a certain number of people will get sick in order to have this greater production. But I agree that we can't separate food safety from these questions around sustainable production or resilience in the food system. And, to the earlier question and the point about true costs, food safety is a cost. And as we've tried to drive down food production costs, sometimes that's resulted in greater risks for food safety. I think that we have the capacity, the technological capacity to produce food in great abundance and safely. I think what we need is the political will to return to the idea where we insist on a lower risk. And again, I believe that comes down as much to political capacity and political will as it does to, say, technology or economics.
Muy bien, vamos a ver una última pregunta de nuestra audiencia para poner término a esta conexión maravillosa que hemos logrado con Estados Unidos sin interrupciones Asumo, Paul, que está preparando algún otro libro. Cuéntenos algo de su producción, aprovechando la instancia.
Thank you for the question. So, I actually I've changed some of my career a bit. I've gone back to more conventional journalism, and I'm now a newspaper writer in Seattle. I still have a plan to write a book, and it just may take longer. It may take a few more years because I have to do it on my weekends and in my evenings. But I do miss being able to take a year, 2 years to work on one subject. And I really miss I really miss traveling to other parts of the world and meeting people and learning something about their food and their culture and the concerns they have. I think I've been in America. I've been in America for too long now, too many years now, and I need to get back out there. But I'll let you know. I'll keep you updated.
Muy bien, no hay más preguntas de la audiencia. Queremos agradecer con este cariñoso aplauso a la distancia. Un abrazo de miles de kilómetros, Paul. Muchas gracias por tu espacio, por abrirnos tu
It was my
espacio
pleasure.
íntimo.
Thank you for the organization and for putting together this very important topic. And I wish you all the best.